we have a tendency to notice when things go wrong and to notice when there is a problem, because that's how we've evolved. We needed that sensitivity to danger and dysfunction to thrive. But I think that we really need to override that assumption that that's the thing that's primary. So what is primary is cooperation. We practice it all the time. Our bodies are models of cooperation with all these different cells and organs and the bacteria and the yeasts and the fungi and the protozoa and all these things that live in us and on us working together. So that being said, I think that in every situation, we need to figure out how to develop cooperative structures to try to move forward.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Welcome back to Care More, Be Better. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Kristin Ohlson to the show. Her work has long inspired me, and I couldn't be more thrilled to share this conversation with you. Kristin Ohlson is a writer whose work uncovers hidden threats of cooperation, resilience, and generosity in both human and ecological systems. She is the author of The Soil Will Save Us, and most recently, Sweet in Tooth and Claw, Stories of Generosity and Cooperation in the Natural World. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Smithsonian, Discover, and more. In Sweet in Tooth and Claw, Kristin flips the traditional Darwinian narrative of Red in Tooth and Claw to reveal how life thrives, not just through competition, but through interdependence and generosity. This message does stand in stark contrast to ideas I explored in a recent conversation with regenerative farmer Molly Engelhardt, who framed Mother Nature as fundamentally conservative. Kristin's book suggests something very different, that nature is, in fact, abundant, creative, and symbiotic. Before we get started, I also want to provide you with an update on our tree planting. As of today's recording, our community has planted 26,277 trees through our partnership with Forest Planet, one tree for every new subscriber on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and our newsletter at caremorebebetter.com. Thank you for helping us restore forests and rebuild ecosystems with every listen and every share. With that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Kristin to the show. Welcome, Kristin.
Hi, great to talk to you, and great news about your tree planting program.
Yeah, so it's just an effort that we started in January. I had a goal of 20,000 by year end, and we hit that in June. So we're just keeping it going, and we'll see how far we get. Could even cross that 40,000 threshold before the year is through.
Super exciting.
I'd love for you to help frame your book, help us understand what inspired you to write Sweet in Tooth and Claw, and perhaps how it came to fruition now.
Well, it's hard putting a finger exactly on where it started, although certainly the seeds of this book, Sweet in Tooth and Claw, were in my last book, The Soil Will Save Us. You know, I was so honored and fortunate to be able to talk to all these farmers and scientists who were investigating how humans could grow things and produce food on farms without damaging landscapes. And, you know, one of the things that I learned right away is that companies that sell gardening chemicals and agricultural chemicals and all those chemicals is that plants are just takers, that they just suck all the goodness and all the moisture and all the nutrients out of the soil. And you just have to keep plopping new chemicals in there to replace all the stuff that the plants have taken. But no, when I was working on that book, I found out that plants are givers and takers, that they are in constant dialogue and constant mediation and constant give and take with the microbes and many, many organisms that live in the soil. So they're constantly taking from the microbes, taking nutrients that microbes bring them, but they're also giving microbes. They're giving microbes moisture. They're giving microbes carbon fuel, you know, this precious high energy fuel that plants make from carbon dioxide. So the roots of Sweet Tooth and Claw are definitely in that earlier book. And I didn't know it then, but that behavior, that helping behavior, is called a mutualism. It's a mutually helpful behaviors between two or more species. So I had written about a mutualism in The Soil Will Save Us, but I didn't really know anything more about it other than that one example. And then when I was at a conference actually talking about The Soil Will Save Us and insights that I got from doing that work, I heard Suzanne Simard, who's a Canadian forest biologist, talking about her work, the work of her and her students, learning to understand how trees cooperate with the fungi in the soil, and how trees of different varieties of trees actually need each other and help each other through the vicissitudes of living in a forest by trading nutrients back and forth through this network of fungi that ties all these trees together, all these plants together in a forest. 300 miles of fungal threads underneath every footprint when we're walking through the forest. So it's an amazing network that's, an amazing trading network that's going on right under our feet. So when I heard that, when I heard Suzanne talking about that, I thought, well, I've got to explore this idea of cooperation in nature. Nobody ever talks about cooperation in nature. Are more people talking about it? How widespread is it? And so that was the genesis of this book.
Yeah, well, human intervention and monocropping seems to be the thing that actually ensures that disease is more likely to take over an entire swath of plants, because it's fertile ground without having any sort of symbiotic relationships between different plants and animal species. So more needs to be learned about this. Of course, we're making steps in regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. The title that you even pose for this book really challenges that age-old metaphor of pure competition, which I think of as more of a patriarchal idea. At any rate, we refer to nature as Mother Nature, and yet try to impose these more capitalistic terms on it at the same time. So how do you see this work reshaping how we really think about nature and even our own relationship with it?
Well, I think that you mentioned the phrase "red in tooth and claw." It's something that everybody knows. Everybody hears that, and it's a line out of a poem by Tennyson from, I think, 175 years ago, and it was a poem that he wrote about the death of a friend, and he talks about nature, bloody nature, taking this friend of his, and so it's a metaphor that we apply in so many situations. When we look out at the bird feeder and see a couple of different birds squabbling over who gets the last seed, we think nature, red in tooth and claw. And it really, a phrase like that that's so deeply embedded in our consciousness really prompts a lot of our behavior. It dictates a lot of our behavior. It gives us a script for how to behave in the world and what we can expect for the world. So I think it's really important that we flip those metaphors. So when I was doing the research for this book, that phrase popped into my head, and I was thinking, no, not red in tooth and claw. Nature is much more sweet in tooth and claw. And of course, that's not to say that there isn't some redness. Of course, we see that redness. My partner and I very much love to go birding, and so we go into this wilderness park where we walk along and we look at the birds, and it's always super exciting when one of the bald eagles that's thriving there zooms down to the pond and snatches up a baby duck. It's very apparent that that's a red example. But all those acts of competition and violence, they grab our attention because we're hardwired to pay attention to that kind of thing. The reality is that all around us, there are all these things, all these living things working together to keep that area healthy. Trees making oxygen, fungi bringing the trees nutrients, even the birds, that there's that other old sort of odious phrase of birds of a feather flock together. No, they don't. The waterfowl are all puddling around together and sleeping on the logs together. There are these clouds of smaller, tiny birds that fly together, mixed flocks. So I think that if we examine some of those metaphors and phrases that have guided us and think, really, that's not true. Let's flip that. I think it makes a big difference if when we're out in nature that we realize that all around us there are these organisms reaching out to each other saying, I've got this. Do you have that? I'll take care of this problem and we can prosper together. That's the truth about what's going on in nature. I mean, one of my favorite examples in my book is the example of two different species of bacteria that live in the oceans. And they make oxygen from sunlight and carbon dioxide. They both do it. But in the process of doing it, they emit a toxic chemical into the water. Well, one of those bacteria has something to counteract. It makes a chemical to counteract that toxic chemical that's in the water. And it does it and takes care of the toxins that both of them create. So that one of these forms of bacteria really is huge. I mean, it's huge amounts of this bacteria, and it produces 5% of the oxygen that's on Earth. And that's because they are cooperating. One is taking on the heavy load of eliminating the problem so that the other can expand and provide all this oxygen. It's just a great example of what's going on quietly around us all the time.
And invisible. It's in the invisible world. Like we really have to take into account that it's not just the things we see, which is my point, I think, when I talk about Molly Englehart's recent book. She describes Mother Nature as conservative, emphasizing things like limits, restrictions, and discipline. Your book offers more of what I deem the opposite view, that nature flourishes through generosity and through cooperation, like the story you just told. So how do you respond to that framing, and why do you think it fits better if we are to put a frame around it?
Okay, well, I haven't read her book, so it's hard to respond to it. And I don't know, certainly nature does have its limits. Certainly nature has its niches, but I think that nature is also massively creative, massively complex and massively creative, and figures out a way to prosper, especially when we humans remove the obstacles that we've placed there. So another story that I love in my book is when the people in Western Oregon switched out. I mean, it just seems like such a simple thing. They switched out a culvert that a stream goes through. So a culvert was put in there, I think 60 years ago, so that cars could drive over this stream. And of course, without realizing it, people had really damaged the ecosystem there. The culvert was way too high above the stream so that salmon couldn't leap up into the culvert and migrate upstream. And the culvert also blocked the kinds of small logs and stones from coming through the culvert and falling into the stream below and creating habitat for salmon. So there was like 18 miles above stream of this culvert where there were no salmon. And, that really impoverished the ecology of that area, because salmon, not only do they feed creatures from tiny creatures to huge creatures, but when bear and eagles and animals like that come and grab the salmon, they eat them and then they drop their carcasses in the forest. And those carcasses themselves, just the carcasses, when they start to decompose on the forest floor, they give a variety of carbon to the forest that's really valuable and comes from deep in the ocean. So people had destroyed that ecology without even realizing it. And then finally, when people did realize it and got together the funding and the resources to switch out that culvert and put one in, then, the creek started to change right away. The salmon started to move upstream. The lampreys started to move upstream. All this thriving was able to begin again because humans had removed the obstacles that we had created.
Well, you hear statistics about forest growth in those areas where salmon are present, and the trees are 50% taller. It's that simple. So, you see a direct effect on the ecology, on the speed and the rapidity with which a forest thrives, and how healthy the entire ecology truly is. So I'm behind and fully support the removal of dams in Northern California. The Klamath has rebounded incredibly quickly. And these are areas that were starting to become more prone to forest fire too, because they just had less moisture coming in. So those rivers returning to their natural state also means like more things for the forest as well. So I'm really encouraged to see that trend continue. So much of that infrastructure has been aging. And while you could make an argument for green energy, it's like, okay, well, but these dams are crumbling and really need to be replaced. Now we're talking millions upon millions of dollars to do so, or we can remove them and start to move renewable energy in a way that is less ecologically damning.
Right. And I think also, one of my other Patagonia authors wrote a book about those dams and
cracks,
how they need to come
Holly,
down.
Right?
Yeah. And I went to hear him speak about it. And one of the things that I think nobody quite understands, except for him and some other people, is that that dammed water is a terrible methane source. That still water. So that's another reason to get rid of them. I mean, there's so many reasons to get rid of them, but that's another one.
And at the same time, create an environment where beavers can thrive and create their own natural dams, right? Yeah. So these two things can go together in a really positive way. And we're seeing that. There are more beavers coming further south into California than they've been in some time. So this is all very encouraging. I did interview Steve Hawley on this podcast around the release of that book, and that episode will be tagged in show notes. I do encourage people to go and listen to that as well.
It's a great book.
Yeah, really great work. Now, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about cooperation. Could you share another example, perhaps, from your book that illustrates this cooperation, perhaps one that might feel more tangible to people living on the coasts or in the forests?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the mutualisms that we see all the time is bees and flowers, and I like to think of people seeing that every day, but and I think somebody would lead a really impoverished life if they didn't get to see that. But it goes on so constantly, and so the bees are going to the flowers to get nectar and sometimes to get pollen. They some bees collect pollen. And in the process, their bodies are covered with pollen. So they're going off to other plants and they're basically fertilizing plants. It's like a third party mating. That's something that's so important. And there's another, maybe a year after I wrote the book, I found out about another relationship, mutualism, that's pretty similar to that. And actually scientists think that it may have preceded bees going to flowers. But there's a little crustacean that lives in the ocean, and it climbs up and down seaweed. And the seaweed provides some nourishment to the little crustacean. And the little crustacean carries around a version of pollen that's in the water, and it provides the same kind of function. So that kind of thing, like those mutualisms are all around us. Keeping things growing, keeping things healthy, contributing to, a stable oxygen supply and stable nitrogen in the soil.
Now, building on your work with The Soil Will Save Us, this earlier work really highlighted the story of soil health and regenerative agriculture. How does this new work really expand or shift that conversation? I know you did also talk about some of those earlier explorations, as in your conversations with Tom Newmark who we've also interviewed in episode 52, which was published back on November 3rd, 2021, a while back. He has been instrumental with the creation of Carbon Underground, which is focused on pulling more carbon underground, as the not-for-profit name would impose that idea. And I know he's also been working on trials that seek to make the soil in his forest or at the Finca Luna Nueva Lodge and farm to make their farming efforts more like that of the forest, to get the levels of carbon into the soil that they were seeing there in Costa Rica. How might we learn more about this story or deepen our understanding of these ecosystems through this work?
Well, I think that, in Sweet and Tooth and Claw, I did try to expand that idea of mutualism that farmers are paying attention to help their crops grow, and apply it to every ecosystem, because those mutualisms are going on in every ecosystem. There's probably, scientists can't say every single organism participates in a mutualism because they haven't tested every single organism, but it's likely that every single organism has some mutualistic relationship with another organization, probably many. So one of the things that I looked at in this book was at coral reefs and the relationships that coral reefs, the mutualisms that keep coral reefs thriving. So a coral animal, we don't think of, we sort of think of coral as being like this crusty piece of composite minerals, but it's an animal that builds that. That's its external skeleton. And that coral animal has a relationship with an algae that it swallows, and then it lives inside it. And the algae provides the coral animal with a carbon nutrient, and the coral animal provides that little algae with nutrients and safety and all that. So one of the things, there are many things, people are obviously very worried about coral bleaching and coral reefs dying, and it would be a tragedy, if the coral reefs died, because they are these incredible hotspots of biodiversity. They're kind of like the Amazon, all through the ocean. Other fish thrive there. There's just so much biodiversity there. So scientists who are studying mutualisms are trying to figure out, what happens when corals bleach? And what happens when corals bleach is that they are losing that symbiotic, that mutualism that lives inside them. They're losing that algae. And why does that happen? Well, heat is one thing, but there are other factors that make that algae break up with its coral host. And, one of the things is fertilizer. We use all the agricultural on Earth gets overdosed with nitrogen-based fertilizer, fertilizer that's been made in a factory. The Earth didn't used to get deluged with that kind of fertilizer before humans figured out how to do that. The Earth got nitrogen from lightning strikes and from microbes. Microbes, famously, people have not known this for a couple of centuries. Microbes set up shop in nodules in the roots of certain plants and concentrate nitrogen that's in the atmosphere and concentrate it in the soil so that the plant can use it, and the plant needs it. And also, recent science has shown that some plants in their leaves can concentrate nitrogen for the plant's use. But, humans have, since we discovered nitrogen fertilizer, which came from our work making weapons. So there was all this nitrogen left over from making weapons, and people started to use it in agriculture. But anyway, that nitrogen that's in that fertilizer is a very different kind of nitrogen than plants and corals evolved to deal with. So that's a problem, that human-made nitrogen that goes into the ocean from our rivers that drain through agricultural lands. That nitrogen disrupts that mutualism. So I think it's really important that scientists are focusing on these mutualisms that that shape ecosystems and that help them continue to thrive, so that we can see, where are we disrupting them? Where are we doing things that are making it that much harder for living things to maintain the relationships that they need?
Well, that, and when they combine fertilizers, it's often an NPK solution, right? So nitrogen, potassium, and why am I forgetting the last one? Phosphorus, right? And phosphorus and potassium are both kind of on the salt side of things. So they could get to the state where they're literally making their rivers more saltish or brackish than a lot of the fish and other species can really manage.
Right.
So it causes them to go from being thriving ecosystems themselves to something else, and often looking murky, and then bringing all that junk into the oceans, which then results in out of control algae blooms that impact the ecosystem there negatively and can actually starve fish of the oxygen they need, which then results in a bunch of dead fish washing ashore, none of which any of us wants to see, right?
Right.
So we can start to work more in symbiosis with nature. I mean, here on the Central Coast of California, one of the things that people see that may help them understand how farmers are now using nitrogen fixing plants is that they'll take mustard and they'll plant it in a fallow field to fix nitrogen to the soil, to then go through and plant strawberries or Brussels sprouts or whatever else in that next season. So you'll see these really wonderful swaths of land that are abloom in all this yellow blossom, and bees are hanging around and pollinating, and all that nitrogen is then getting fixed in the soil without having to use just this top fertilizer kind of approach. And the results in the end are often way better, and they can just simply crimp the mustard through not exactly a plowing, but like crimping the base of it,
right.
Then allow the plant to decay on the land and infuse more nutrients into the soil.
I just love stories like that. It's so often when you drive along the highway, what you see instead is a completely bare, tilled field, and you'll see somebody doing tillage off in the distance, and soil just flying off through the air. And every time I see that, I just
and then they come through with the big sprayers.
Yeah.
And, basically spray a bunch of chemicals to kill pests and weeds, and then douse it with fertilizers, and then do the planting season. And it's just like, what are we doing? And farmers in those cases are spending millions upon millions of dollars on chemical abatement.
They're spending so much money, and they're held, I was driving out in the country not too long ago and looking at a big tilled field, and people often ask me, why don't farmers change? Well, if they know that all this healthier regenerative stuff works, why don't they change? And, here people are barely making a living. All those old farming practices or those, not old farming practices, but those farming practices that became prevalent, those extractive farming practices that became prevalent in the last half of the 20th century. They are held in place by the ag colleges, still teach to do things that way. The county extension people still teach it. The banks expect the farmers to do things that way. It's so tough for them to make changes.
Well, and, it does take some time. So we've seen some really incredible stories come out of the regenerative agriculture space. In some cases, they're able to intersperse crops and have, ground cover crops that are in place even while they're farming the primary crop. That's harder in the world of things like grains. So, again, it really depends on what you're trying to grow, and then what application of what tools you can use to best do so. But we're getting better at it all the time, and we're learning from nature, from stories like those told in your book, and from test plots that are being run, to see what is achievable through the efforts of people like Tom Newmark at Finca Luna Nueva in Costa Rica, working on this kind of agroforestry perspective where
it is a beautiful place. I've been there.
I have yet to be there.
It
That
is
on my
heavenly.
bucket list. Yes.
I have a friend who's going to Costa Rica in a couple of weeks, and I said, "Oh, you have to go to Tom Newmark's farm."
Yes. And now Rick Scalzo, who was the founder of Gaia Herbs and now has another brand called Kokura Life, also has a farm down there. So I have reasons to go, and I hope to visit at some point in the next year.
You know, one of the things that I love when I hear stories about farmers and ranchers who have been able to make a change, who have, bolstered their hearts and had some help and gone ahead and made some changes, is how much people love their work so much more, how much they are thrilled at the nature that is burgeoning around them. One of the stories that I wrote about in my book was of these ranchers in southeast Nevada who changed their their grazing practices. And as your readers probably know, southeastern Nevada is an exceptionally dry place. There's these little threads of moisture that go through the land, and everybody wants those little threads of moisture. And all these cattle ranchers, typically they turn their cattle out for 8 months of the year just to roam the landscape and graze it. And in the process, they were destroying the creeks because they would congregate there and their hooves would break up all the vegetation nearby. And that meant that when the rains would come, there was no vegetation to hold the banks in place. And these creeks were becoming deeper and more channelized and drier, and they would dry up in the summer, and they were just a mess. And some scientists approached the ranchers about changing their grazing practices because the creeks had become so dry and miserable that the local trout were not thriving in them anymore, and they were worried that it was no longer going to provide habitat for them. So they talked some of these ranchers into changing their grazing practices. And instead of letting their animals wander around wherever they wanted to be for 8 months of the year, they only let them get near the creeks for a brief period of time. And then they had to graze elsewhere. And so the ranchers were pretty excited that vegetation started to spring up right away. That in the soil, even though nobody had planted seeds are always in the soil. So once the cows weren't there, making it impossible for the plants to grow, all these plants started to grow along all this riparian vegetation started to take place. And so the ranchers were very excited about that. They thought they had done their job. And then all of a sudden, beaver, which had been almost eradicated completely in that area, showed back up again, and they started cutting down the willows and some of these other plants alongside the creeks to make ponds. And it just completely changed the ecology there. Instead of these degraded creeks where the water just raced through the landscape, the beavers were damming it. They were creating ponds. The ponds were spreading out. The water table in the surrounding lands started to change. The creeks started to grow in length because when the beavers would dam them, the creeks would start to, form kinks and move around. So instead of there being these long, straight creeks, they were these creeks that were like this. And pretty soon we had wetlands there, and it changed the landscape so immensely. Now they have a ton of wildlife. But I remember this one rancher telling me that, and his land became, because of the beavers, because of the changing water table, because of all of that, he had less fire risk, he had more wildlife, everything was better for him. But I remember him saying that before that had happened, and this ranch had been in his family for generations, that before that had happened, he had never gotten just flattened out on the earth to look at how the plants were distributed on the ground, to look at the soil. And it just made him so much more aware of this incredible living ecosystem that he was the steward of. And
now you're reminding me of Will Harris. Is that who you're speaking to?
oh no, I'm not speaking of Will Harris. I'm speaking of A.G. Now I can't remember his last name. I think it's Smith.
Yeah, I just want people to know that this story is told by numerous farmers and ranchers. In this case, Will Harris tells a story that's very similar to one you're sharing in his book, A Bold Return to Giving a Damn, which is all about his journey and basically going to regenerative ranching. And he talks about the reality of having to move the cows on his land because they will want to rest in the shade and the creek beds. And if you don't move them off that land, if you don't basically make them do what they would have done in nature, which is remain a migrating herd, then they will just stick where it's comfy because they've got enough resources around them and enjoy a bit of shade and mud. And so it's not entirely surprising. Will Harris also narrates his own book. I've listened to your book and his in sequence on Audible, so people can pick it up on Audible and give it a listen too.
Will Harris is great. I just have so much admiration for all these people. I mean, they really are innovators and pioneers, all these farmers and ranchers who have broken with the extractive, damaging way of growing food and figured out how to do it with nature, figured out how to learn from nature, and are, not only have thriving businesses and healthier food, but these thriving, beautiful landscapes.
Well, and they've been able to do it even while bucking tradition and going against the grain of what people told them that they should be doing, because they had some conviction that what they were doing was right.
Right.
And so I think that's really what it is going to take, instead of bending to the Cargills and the Monsantos of the world and just continuing to use, seed stocks that they've patented and pesticides and growing tools that are not natural. Let's just put it that way. Now, another thing you speak to in this book is Indigenous knowledge and science. You, I think, mentioned more than once Robin Wall Kimmerer and some others. I'd love for you to talk a bit about Indigenous traditions that emphasize reciprocity and kinship. Did your research specifically highlight these intersections between Indigenous knowledge and modern ecological science?
I mentioned it, and I honestly don't know nearly as much as I should. I know that a lot of the tribes that I hear about and run into at different conferences here in Portland have scientists, and I know that those scientists talk about the importance of bringing those two traditions together. I mean, it just makes sense. The native people of North America were here for millennia, and they were paying attention. They knew when two things that existed together in nature they knew when two organisms were helping each other. They knew that when one kind of fish came along, another one would come along soon enough. They knew to take enough, but not too much. So I think that it's really important that somebody like Robin Wall Kimmerer, I remember there was a book. Let's see if I can remember the title. I remember there was a book years ago called something like "When the Student is Ready, the Teacher Will Come." And I kind of feel like that's who Robin Wall Kimmerer is, that we are all ready to bring together those two amazing traditions, to bring together that Indigenous knowledge with modern science, which she does in her own person. I mean, that's what she does. And that's the key to our thriving in the future.
I will point people to her work, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a collection of essays, but it is so story-driven and so profound. There's an essay in there that I think perfectly illustrates the symbiosis and the mutualism that we see in nature when she talks about the gift of the three sisters, which are the plants of squash, corn, and a bean. because the bean helps to fix nitrogen and it will climb the stalks of the corn. So it doesn't compete necessarily for light with the corn, right? It's climbing the stalk. The corn itself produces the abundance of the corn itself, which is, used as maize and traditional cultures around the globe. There are so many species of corn in the Americas, right? And then also at the same time having the squash growing at its base because it's a cover crop and it keeps soil moist. So you have better growth and at the same time produces an abundant crop at the end of the season. So you essentially have got food coming throughout the summer and into the fall harvest. And each of these plants works together. So people from tribal lands throughout the Southwest in particular would give these three seeds as a gift wrapped in corn husk, as a signal to abundance, as a signal to what nature is capable of, and to also giving the gift of life to somebody in your circle that could benefit from these things. So I love this concept. I love this idea. And I think more people need to share more stories like this of the symbiosis, of the mutualism that they're seeing in their environments. So let's see. I'd love to talk a bit about the human implications of your work. We often glorify individualism and competition, as we've talked a bit about. How might our culture change if we elevated cooperation as the primary story of life?
Yeah, I think that we really have to start by acknowledging how much cooperation exists already. I mean, we are an incredibly cooperative species. And, I always sort of laugh when, you start to watch a movie and if it's a movie that's set in the city, if you hear a siren, then you're supposed to know, oh, it's dangerous. There's dangerous, bad things happening. And every time I hear that, I think, no, that means help is on the way. That means we have systems set up to help people when there is a problem. So I really do think that we have to readjust and think about how much cooperation is in a hospital, how much cooperation is in city planning, how much cooperation is in a neighborhood. So, and acknowledge that is, I think a much more defining characteristic of human beings than competition. If two of my neighbors are outside sharing tools or exchanging plants, I'm not going to notice that. If they get into an argument and start to yell at each other, of course I'm going to notice that. So we have a tendency to notice when things go wrong and to notice when there is a problem, because that's how we've evolved. We needed that sense, that sensitivity to danger and dysfunction to thrive. But I think that we really need to override that assumption that that's the thing that's primary. So what is primary is cooperation. We practice it all the time. Our bodies are models of cooperation with all these different cells and organs and the bacteria and the yeasts and the fungi and the protozoa and all these things that live in us and on us working together. So that being said, I think that in every situation, we need to figure out how to develop cooperative structures to try to move forward. And, back to the ranchers who were trying to change their grazing practices in Nevada, trying to rehabilitate their lands and rehabilitate their creeks. They didn't set upon that singly. They didn't each go back to their ranches and say, okay, we're going to do it this way. Let's see what happens. No, they formed a big cooperative council. So it was ranchers that were on the council. It was scientists that were on the council. It was people from some of those agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies that have something to do with land management in the West. And it was all these people, and it was a coordinator who works with groups and helps them talk to each other. So they were very, very intentional about wanting to find a way to work together. And these are people who did not always work together. These are people who did not always get along. In fact, usually those ranchers, when they saw somebody from Bureau of Land Management arrive on their farm, it was like, oh God, now what? What are they going to want me to do? But they completely created a new structure and culture of cooperation to get this very difficult and challenging and exciting work done. And it worked. And I think as much as we can do that everywhere, we should be trying to figure out how to work together, how to create structures that help us get along and tackle problems.
Well, one of the things I noticed in reading your book, and as I've noticed in reading many of the books that Patagonia Press has released in this space of nature and wellness, regenerative systems, things like the Cracked Dams by Stephen Hawley, or through your work, is really this blending of science with awe and wonder, or this blending of nature with awe and wonder. Do you think this is an intentional balance, or is it just something that's part of the undercurrent in the space?
I think it's certainly intentional on Patagonia's part. That is sort of the heart and soul there of embracing nature. I don't think you can embrace nature without embracing both science and beauty. I mean, if you just embrace the beauty of nature without understanding the science there, it's a little impoverished. The more that you understand, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about writing a book like Sweet in Tooth and Claw. When I'm out in nature now, I really have a completely different view about what's going on. It's not just the beautiful bird flying by or the beautiful bark of a tree. When I look at the bark of that tree and I think, wow, I now know, because some science was done not too long ago, I now know that the bark of that tree is a methane sink. It removes methane from the atmosphere. I mean, I knew before that the tree also removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but I didn't know that. I just think the more science that you bring to your appreciation of nature, the more beautiful it is. I mean, and I think that's what Robin Wall Kimmerer is all about. She's a poet and a scientist and a lover of nature and of life. So I think that, the more you know, the more beautiful it is. It's just almost like magic.
Well, the miles of fungal networks beneath your feet as you're walking through one of these old growth forests, the fact that it has such a different smell and feel, that people feel an uplifted sense just spending time in forests, like nature bathing in a forest or by a river and a creek. I mean, it's incredibly rewarding to the senses.
Right. It's incredibly rewarding. And I think that more and more the science is going to show that that's not just a psychological thing. I mean, it's not like, it's true that I think there are some studies that show that even if you look at a picture of a forest, you feel a little better. But I think that the science is going to more and more show that the magic of forest bathing, or the magic of taking a walk anywhere where you're surrounded by nature, it's not just that the sight of it makes you feel better. It's that those trees and those plants and the soil are emitting chemicals that affect our body. I mean, we evolved out of the luscious nature that Earth provides. We evolved in dense, thick forests and grasslands, where all these other parts of nature's, plants communicate by chemicals. They don't communicate by sound. Microbes communicate by chemicals. All those chemical signals, when we're just stuck in a house and never get outside, we are cutting ourselves out from those inputs that were integral to our evolution.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I try to, on my morning walks, go and touch what I consider the oldest tree in my loop, and visit with my old friend Maple, which is this struggling maple tree that someone decided to cable to keep it from falling over, even though it doesn't seem like it's on any particular person's land, and she's covered in moss and growing kind of sideways, but, it's also a tree I visit after every storm and go, oh, she's still standing. It gives me a little comfort,
Well, I do the same thing. When I'm out walking around, I touch the trees. I put my nose up in the bark and in the moss and take a deep breath. That is medicine.
Commune
there,
with nature. Yeah.
surrounding us.
With it. Now, I see storytelling itself as cooperative. That's part of this podcast. I wonder how you see storytelling as a cooperative act. Do you consider it something that connects science to the heart, or am I on a good track here, or is that something that's a little harder of a leap for you to make?
I definitely see storytelling as it's cooperative in the sense that you're trying to make something matter to somebody else. It's an act that you're trying to connect with somebody else through words and gesture, and art sometimes. But, and I think that lots of times, it's very hard. If any of your listeners and you have tried to read scientific papers, it's very hard for those messages to resonate. But I think that when you can tell a story and tell it in a way that stirs the emotions of somebody listening, that's scientific development, that event really takes hold of them in a completely different way. I mean, and I can tell you that when I wrote the story of those ranchers in Nevada, and how they changed their landscape, and how they created wetlands, and how they built these structures to allow them to talk to each other and to the scientists and to the agency people. And especially since these were ranchers who were really struggling about how are they going to make a living, and also struggling with the idea that so many people have that cattle ranching is a great evil that destroys land. They were feeling like the bad guy, and they were feeling like
or methane is causing global warming.
Right. They were feeling like the bad guy, and they were feeling like they were at the end of a dwindling tradition. And when I was telling that story in the book, I would get really emotional and like weepy. Because I was so moved by their story. I was so moved by what they were able to do by paying attention to what the land needed, what the other living things needed, by cooperating with nature, and how much they got back in return. I just think that is incredibly moving. So I do think that a story like that, when you're trying to make somebody else feel as strongly about that as you do, that is, in a way, an act of cooperation.
Yeah. And I will say that your emotion comes through as you tell these stories. It really does. So it helps this book be something that is easily digestible, the audiobook as well as the physical book. And I will definitely proudly keep it on my shelf and share with friends as well.
It has such pretty pictures.
It does. This is something that is not atypical for Patagonia books, but like just going to a 2-page spread and seeing a beautiful riverbed. There's several of those throughout this book, and you really can read it in a somewhat chapterized way. I mean, you speak of corals, and then you have these pictures showing ocean, sky, and corals all in one, which
so beautiful.
I mean, they're like National Geographic caliber photographs interspersed amongst the pages of well-told stories. So I appreciate that about this work, and I highly encourage my listeners to pick it up. You can do so with the audiobook version, and also pick up this book on Patagonia, or just through the direct link in my show notes. I'm going to link it in my Amazon shop as well. So you can pick it up for Kindle, or you can pick up the physical copy. I frankly recommend the physical copy. I have to do audiobooks to get through the number of books I'm reading while also pursuing my PhD in sustainability. So one foot in front of the other. How else can listeners find you and engage with your work to stay connected?
I have a website, www.kristinohlson.com, and I put, there are different podcast interview there. There are, and new things that I write are posted there. That's pretty much it right now.
Great. Now, here on the Care More Be Better show, we are planting a tree for every new subscriber. So if you like today's episode and you want us to plant more trees, please join this effort. In the spirit of your book, why do reforestation efforts like the one we're undertaking matter?
Oh, reforestation is so important. Forests are such a wonderful, rich environment for so many different creatures, and we've lost so many forests on Earth, and we need to build up that stock again. Yeah. So anybody doing reforestation thoughtfully and regeneratively, such a good effort.
Well, right now we're focused on a mangrove reforestation project in Africa, which also ends up being an estuary for all sorts of species of fish that are connected to the coasts. And that's helpful in a number of ways as well, because many of our fish species are declining with their shrinking habitats. Like when you have mangroves cut down for any number of reasons, then you lose that space for their young stage of fish to survive and thrive.
Right.
So,
oh, yeah. And, that was another thing that I did write about in this book, was about people planting trees along waterways just to shade the water, just so that the salmon and other fish aren't overheated. Super important.
Yeah, especially as you have increasing storms coming through and ripping out some of that forested land. Right. You need to constantly replenish. Right. If there is one hope that you have for this book, or one idea that you hope that people will bring from it to change their perspective, what might it be?
I just think it's super important to realize that life is largely a cooperative act, and that when we walk through the world, we're witnessing, but probably not seeing, multiple, probably thousands of acts of cooperation among living things that are keeping our planet healthy and shaping it. And that we are part of nature. We are just like that. So I think that with the old metaphors, the survival of the fittest and, red in tooth and claw, those were metaphors that made us think that life is just a zero-sum game. For us to thrive, that means that everything else has to suffer. And that is really not true, that we can figure out how to live in this world and help it thrive at the same time.
Move out of scarcity into ideas of abundance.
Yeah, definitely. And
that's something that's hard to, I think, contend with when you may have grown up in a city and seen nothing but limits for much of your life, So get out there in nature and enjoy it. See a space, visit a farm, and see how these things happen in real life. And I will always encourage people to try and shop and buy their foods from local sources. In many cases, it's just not possible, so you have to go elsewhere, but you can seek out regenerative farms and, different products that help you live more sustainably. I frankly buy our meats from a regenerative rancher in the Midwest, and we just have shipments come a couple times a year, put it in our chest freezer, and I know I'm getting healthfully raised animals as opposed to something that lived a more stressful and awful last hour. So try to keep that as nice of a life as possible for something that's giving its life to end up on your plate. And when we do things more responsibly like this, then we are, I think, automatically living in a more collaborative fashion. Thank you so much for your time today. I thoroughly enjoyed this interview.
Great to talk.
Wow, what an insightful interview. Well, I hope that you take the opportunity to pick up a copy of Kristin Ohlson's book, Sweet in Tooth and Claw. You'll find the stories in here both compelling and nourishing and informational. You'll learn a lot. And I think it will truly help you engage with nature and with life in a different way. As a reminder for all of our followers, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or even to our newsletter, we are planting a tree. Today, we crossed 26,266 trees planted. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do and help us build that greener future. Together, we're helping life flourish, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.